So team, I'm super excited for this video and this unit because what we are going to do is literally talk about the story of life, how life started and where it came from. So let's get going. But before we do that, keep in mind that this is an epic journey that we are about to embark on that will have confusion and miracle and wonder and awe. And it just starts with a very simple question, which is, where did life come from? But before we really get into that, it's worth to step back and realize that if you ask that question, the answer is depends. Depends on who you ask. So many a great people have thought about this question. So for example, if you ask the ancient Greeks where life came from, well, they would tell you this story about Gaia and about the Titans, someone Kronos, the Olympic gods. It would be sons overthrowing their fathers, and it's an incredible story. But if you ask the Mayans, well, they would tell you about Tepu and Gugamats, who simply sat together and thought whatever they wanted to come into being. If you asked Muslims, well, they would say, of course, that life came from the one true God, Allah, praise be upon him. If you asked the Navajo, well, they would say that life began with the holy wind that blew across the four corners of the earth and gave life to divine supernatural beings, which later created earth and life. And if you ask the Chamorro, who are the indigenous people of Guam, well, they will tell you it came from Fu'una. And what Fu'una did is she took red earth and mixed it with water to make a great rock, which you can still see today off the coast of the island. And that great rock later divided into many stones that became people. And if you ask science, science will say it came from atoms. So the point here is that there are many, many, many great people who have thought about this question, which is why it's how we know it's an interesting question, one worth exploring. That people have thought about this for so long and really wondered, where did life come from? And at the same time, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that of all of these responses, this is the only one, the scientific one, that we will talk about in this class. Is it because it's the only one? No. Is it because it's the only important one? No. Only interesting one? No, of course not. But it is the only one that fits within the confines of science, right? It's the only one that we're capable of scientists, of explaining and exploring, right? And therefore the only one that we'll discuss in this class. But I do hope that you as curious individuals in the rest of your life explore these other ones as well, if that interests you. So with that being said, keep that on the back of your mind. Everything we talk about now when we have these questions are going to be always from the scientific lens. So where did life come from? Well, when we say that, we're talking about complex life. So a tree is a great example of something we call complex. It's made up of many cells. It's what you just think about when you see around the world. Now, where did that life come from? There have not always been trees on this planet. 4.6 billion years ago, there were no trees. So how did they appear? And what we'll see is that this story is this great story that starts off with something called inorganic molecules. Those are like the things that are in the air right now, like the nitrogen gas that you're breathing in. That's an example of an inorganic molecule. And what we're going to try to convince you is that those things turned into complex life. And hopefully you're wondering, well, how the heck does air turn into a tree? And the answer is slowly and in multiple steps. So what we don't see is inorganic molecules just magically coming together all in a moment and poof, making a tree in a day. Instead, over billions of years, what happened is those inorganic molecules slowly turned into something called organic molecules. Those organic molecules then slowly became very, very simple cells. And we will talk more about how simple these things really are and really kind of expand your boundaries of what are the minimum requirements of something to be a cell and alive. And then those simple cells then turned into more complex cells. And then those complex cells came together to make multicellular complex life, right? Now, before we keep going, there is a key concept here, which is that this idea of complexity arising from many small, less complex steps is a key theme to explaining our biological world. We have actually seen this already before when we talked about evolution last unit, right? It's these small, tiny little steps over long periods of time that slowly accumulate in order to make these more complex forms that we see. So just keep an eye out for that and notice that as we walk through the unit. So there are many steps here to getting into life. And what we're going to do is we're going to break them down and each day talk about one of these parts. So today we're talking about just this first step. If we want to explain how life came about, the first thing we have to be able to explain is how inorganic molecules became organic molecules. So that is part one, and then we'll do the other parts in future classes. Right? And again, what we will do is we will look at the evidence. Right? What is the evidence that we have as scientists that make us believe this is true? And again, as we go back to that first part of all the different stories out there of where life came from, that's really one of the things that makes this approach unique, right? The scientific worldview is one that is based on evidence. And so we will have to try to draw that out and examine it here today. Okay. But before we do that, just some terminology. We want to make sure you know the difference between inorganic and organic molecules. We've already talked about, we kind of introduced those. So what do they mean? So in general, and again, this is sort of a simplification, but it'll get us started. Inorganic molecules do not have carbon in them, and organic molecules do. And the second major difference is that inorganic molecules are not used to build living things, but organic molecules are. So, for example, hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is this molecule right here. It's two hydrogen atoms bonded together. Now, there's no carbon there, and they're also not used to build any living thing. You don't put a bunch of hydrogen gas together to make a tree or a rat. But over here, what we have is another molecule. This is called a fatty acid. All these different little circles are different atoms. So there's hydrogens and carbons and oxygens. And these little black parts in the middle are a bunch of carbons. So lots of carbon here. And this is called a fatty acid. It's a fat. Fat is definitely used to build organisms. Fat is actually in every single cell of your body. Okay? So what we're talking about again is that when Earth first started, all we had were these kinds of inorganic molecules, and somehow they had to turn into things like this. That was just the first step. And this matters because if we look at ancient Earth, again, 4.5 billion years ago, if we could zoom in here, right, this artist rendition, you have to imagine it looked completely different. And it looks something like this, right? There was nothing alive as we know it today. There weren't lands. There wasn't oceans. It was this molten, energetic place. And this is obviously an artist renditioning, so this is not exactly what it looked like, but it's trying to get you that sense of a place that is devoid of life, but there is an incredible amount of energy. You can see the volcanoes exploding, lightning in the background, this hot magma flowing over the surface of the Earth. Incredibly inhospitable to life at this point, but plenty of things out there. And what were those things? All right. So these things that were here were inorganic molecules. And what we want to find is the evidence of how life could form on this barren place. How could organic molecules and life possibly start off here? So what evidence do we have that this happened? Okay, so there's a very famous experiment that was done by two individuals whose last names were Miller and Urey. It's called the Miller-Urey experiment. And we want to walk you through it because it has a lot to do with our question. So here's what they did. Miller and Urey set out to try and collect evidence to demonstrate that organic molecules could have formed on early Earth. What we knew about early Earth is that in this scene, what was there? Okay, well, what we had here were inorganic molecules, so that would be in the atmosphere. What we knew is we had this right here. This is steam, right? So we had water. In fact, all the water that we have on our planet here today, all the oceans, it was still present on early Earth. It was just in steam. It was in the atmosphere, it was evaporated. And over time, as the planet cooled, that water condensed and then formed the oceans we have today. And then we also had energy. So three things, right? Inorganic molecules, water vapor, and lightning. So what they did is they created this apparatus, and this is like a giant, imagine these glass tubes they put together in a lab. And in this little container, they tried to recreate those conditions. They put inside of here some water, right, and a heat source. And they heated that water up to create steam. And that steam went up here, and then it went into this chamber. And once it got to that chamber, they mixed it with these gases or molecules. These are a bunch of inorganic molecules here. And they added electricity, lightning. And then they mixed these things together, they let them condense, and then they collected the water here. And in the next video, I'll explain what they found.